redistricting really doesn't exist as a political issue until the decision by the Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr. Until then, the United States Supreme Court always sort of brushed off questions about political representation by saying that they were a political matter to be decided by the legislature. The problem is, of course, the legislature was deciding how to allocate power within the legislature and who should be allowed to vote and how the vote should be counted for itself. And so the losing side could never get the legislature to redistribute its own power. In other words, there's this circularity problem that you were asking a body to reform itself when it was incapable of doing it. Well, finally, the Supreme Court, after decades of trying to avoid getting involved, finally just threw up its hands and decided that it would wade into this. And it never really managed to wade back out. It has turned out to be an intractable problem. So the Supreme Court pretty abruptly in 1963 or 4 decides that the whole question is what it called justiciable. In other words, that the courts would get involved in it and oversee it. They thought they would just say some simple things like one man, one vote, and then everybody would take care of it. The problem was that it just opened a whole new political battlefield for both sides. And it wasn't Democrats, Republicans, it was actually many sides. But for all the participants to now fight over political power, in the old days, before Baker versus Carr, what happened was that lines didn't get redrawn, except very, very slightly. And so whoever was represented 100 years ago is still represented even if they had no longer any population. The newly created cities with large populations didn't get any new districts. Well, now we suddenly have a whole new battlefield, as I said, and so everybody is now drawn to the question of how the lines will be drawn. The Supreme Court has essentially said that there have to be new lines drawn, but they didn't say how they would be done. It just said you can't go on doing what you're doing. So the very first drawings of lines were crazy. And this is where the whole mythology of redistricting comes from, the crazy gerrymanders that existed in the first couple of rounds, first in the early 60s in response to the Supreme Court decision, and then following the 1970 census to take effect in 1972. The districts that were drawn were very creative, and it was just Wild West. So there were almost no rules. So there were districts in other states, for example, that connected particular populations, say a Republican area in one city, and it would run down a freeway, just the median of the interstate highway to another city, and it would pick up 20 or 40,000 people off, say, the north side of another city, and then it would go south for 50 miles and pick up a large county, and then it would, in other words, these things looked more like fungus, the little tentacles and growths and offshoots of plants, than they did like natural boundaries, like a forest or a meadow. They didn't look square or circular. They looked like little splotchy things with extensions. So, and of course, it meant that whoever was elected to represent them didn't represent any kind of a community. They represented this manipulated, fictitious, created collection of odd little pieces of territory that were glued together. It was almost like a collage. Each one was like an artistic creation. Well, that was true in the first couple of districtings, but over time, rules have been imposed to sort of formalize the process, to make it more bearable, I guess. And even though there was nobody pushing for reform has sort of happened to the process. And so over time, each districting, each census that comes out, the actual process of drawing districts has resulted in districts which are less crazy looking and which are better drawn from a perspective of actually representing people. Now, I don't want to make it sound like, that this whole process is an exercise in enlightenment, because it's not. But what people talk about, the mythology of districting, is largely talking about past practices which are no longer possible. Okay? So in Michigan, the 1960 districting was, or 1964 was quite crazy. The 1970 districting was controlled by the Democrats in both the Congress and the legislature, and so it was heavily drawn to favor the interests of the Democratic Party, and particularly the UAW. In 1980 and 1990 in Michigan, something very bizarre happened. This is sort of part of the narrative I was describing before. As I say, nationally, we see a movement toward reform, but it had very odd, specific details in Michigan. The Michigan Supreme Court happened to be split 4-3, controlled by the Democrats in both 1980 and in 1990. Actually, I should say 81 and 91, following the censuses those years. But the fourth liberal, the fourth Democrat in each case was Charles Levin. And Charles Levin really believed that there should be some way to get the Supreme Court out of the redistricting process. What happened was that when the legislature was unable to adopt a single plan, or the legislature and the governor clashed, eventually this would always find its way back to the courts. And so the districting plans found their way to the Supreme Court, the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was expected to choose between two plans, and was told by the state constitution that you had to pick the Democratic plan or the Republican plan. You couldn't do anything else. Charles Levin didn't like that. Well, but it was the state Supreme. It was the state Supreme Court is governed by the state constitution, right? So there was a 6-1 vote in 1981 that said, essentially, you have to, we've agreed we have to follow the Constitution. And the one loser, you would think, was Charles Levin, who said, no, I'm not going to follow the state Constitution. And the other 6 said, well, you have to. So you have to choose one of the two plans. And he said, no, I'm not going to choose one of the two plans. So there's a 3-3 vote, with Charles Levin refusing to vote for either side and saying, no, we're going to make up our own rules. Well, there was no constitutional law that permitted them to make up their own rules. Charles Levin just made up his own rules. And eventually, the other 6 were forced to go along with it, because after all, they couldn't come up with a majority of 7, since there were 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So in both 1980 and in 1990, Charles Levin forced everybody else to go along with it. I say 1980, but again, it was 81 to go into effect 1982. In 1981, he basically turned the process over to Bernard Apel, who was the director of elections for the state. And so what we had was Charles Levin just making up rules, which he just pretended that he found them in the Constitution, but he really just pretty much pulled them out of his ass. But they were reasonable. They were reasonable principles for following, but they weren't from some other higher power. He just made them up. He turned them over to Bernie Apel, and Apel did the best he could to draw districts. Now, Apel, although he was supposedly nonpartisan, was probably slightly Republican, so he had a slight Republican leaning. And so the plan may have slightly favored the Republicans, but not in any dramatic way. Well, so that was done in 1980, and everybody assumed by 1990 they would be back to their old tricks, and either Democrats or Republicans would control the process. But again, in 1990, the same balance occurred, and again, they went through the same exercise using a fairly nonpartisan person to draw districts using these fairly even-handed rules. So that gets us through 1990, and what I'm saying is that from the 1970 districting, which was bitterly partisan and which was obviously written to favor the Democratic Party, 1980 and 1990 you had a process that was pretty even-handed and using neutral rules, trying not to divide counties, not to divide townships, not to divide cities unnecessarily, and of course to have relatively equal populations. By the year 2000, Bernie Apel and Charles Levin are long gone. The Republicans were in control of both houses of the legislature and of the Supreme Court and of the governorship. But instead of getting involved, going back to the old days, they still found themselves relatively constrained by this idea of reform. So they drew districts which certainly favored the Republican Party, but which were not nearly as blatant as the old days, where people basically, the people drawing the districts had a completely free hand to do anything came into their heads to do. So the districts that were drawn in 2000 were reasonably square, were reasonably, they didn't divide townships and cities arbitrarily and wildly. Okay, so now we get to 2010, and of course we haven't seen what the Republicans are going to spring on us, because they have no incentive to produce anything until the last minute. They're certainly, they've certainly drawn a set of districts, they certainly have a plan already, but they're not going to let us see it until the last possible minute to make it as difficult as possible to challenge. But I'm sure that overall they're not going to divide a lot of townships and cities willy-nilly. They're not going to connect, two distant cities, by running down a freeway median or following a river or the space between the two tracks of a railroad. Just imagine districts that are contiguous by the 2.5 feet between the rails of a railroad. And that was the kind of districts that were drawn in the early periods all over the United States after Baker versus Carr. So that kind of gets us to where we are. I mean, it's now a political process. It's under the control of the legislature, which is entirely Republican, and where the Republicans have very large majorities. But I think that they will be somewhat constrained by this gradually growing tradition of principle, I guess I would say. That there are rules that are sensible to follow, and we should try to follow the rules, and sort of not getting caught is good, not being blatant.